Well, thank you very much, Dr. Whelton, for a really informative talk. Do we have any questions from the audience? And yes, let's start here.
Hi, I'm Barbara Hanna. I'm from Caring Choices. I live up in Butte County, and we were the volunteer center that produced all the spontaneous volunteers and put them out. We're currently involved in recovery. This was a fascinating presentation. One of the questions that I have is, I'm also a public health nurse, and so one of the questions that I have is, where is this stuff going now? I see, you know, Andy talked about the trucks every day, which we see every day. Where is this stuff going right now? And is it similar to like what happens with gas stations when they pull the big tanks out? How does that, where does it go, and how does it stay, keep the rest of our water tables safe?
So that's a great question. The hydrant flushing that was conducted, that water was generally being discharged to the ground initially. And not all of the water is as contaminated as other water that's being discharged. And primarily, too, it takes a little while to get water testing data back. So it would be, you would take a sample, and then it would take 3 to 5 days before you get the results of that. So what the Paradise Irrigation District has been doing is trying to figure out what the scale of contamination is and then what to do with that water. The Regional Water Quality Control Board, I believe, has an opinion on what is appropriate to do with that water, if you're allowed to discharge it to the ground or if you have to test it first. And I haven't seen that made public, but I believe that that's something that they have domain over. The other issue is the contaminated infrastructure. And so if you pull the pipe out of the ground, which was, say, 2,217 parts per billion of benzene, according to RCRA, the Resources Conservation and Recovery Act, that would exceed one of their limits to make it a characteristic hazardous waste, which is 500 parts per billion, according to a test called the TCLIP. And so this is another issue that they're struggling with, they being the organizations that have this infrastructure, is determining how to handle this material safely and how to also protect the public from coming into contact with it if it is needing that extra scrutiny.
Hi, I'm Sumi Hoshiko with the California Department of Public Health. So this is not my area, and I'm just trying to understand, you showed that slide of the melted plastic meter and pipes. When those PVC pipes melt, do they release benzene and the other chemicals? And is that what you're hypothesizing is the source of contamination? And are we making that leap, or are a lot of other possibilities being considered?
So that's a great question. PVC does release VOCs and SVOCs, like benzene and ethylene and phenanthrene and anthracene, when it's burned. High-density polyethylene, which is this black pipe here shown, is also releases VOCs and SVOCs when it's burned. And so we don't know which of these is responsible, or if it's a multitude of things that are causing the contamination. But they are both plausible that they could be occurring at some level. There is concern that maybe the infrastructure that was closest to the ground surface, like the service line or the meter, was burned, and then the materials then found their way into the water and were siphoned back into the system. That is another possibility. But this area needs a ton of scientific effort on it, both from the can contaminated air get sucked into the water system and how much contamination is caused by that versus this type of work.
Kathleen Stratton's going to ask the next question from the webinar audience.
Right, this is a question from Kristen Cooper from the North State Water Treatment Services. And Kristen has several questions, so I'm going to ask two of them now, and if there's time, I'll ask the other ones. The first one is, how much guidance and assistance was provided by the SWRCB Drinking Water Division during the Camp Fire, based on what they learned in the Tubbs Fire? And the follow-up is, do you have any observations on what could have been done better early on, right after the fire?
So, how much? I was called in January and spoke with the State Water Resource Control Board then, and individuals that were responding were not involved in the Tubbs fire, and so much of what was learned in the Tubbs fire really wasn't transmitted to the people that were involved in the campfire response. So, some of the information. The assumption that if you smell the water and there's no odor that it's safe is just not it's not accurate, because you can't really smell benzene in water unless it's 2,000 parts per billion, and 200 is the acute exposure limit. So that there were some mistakes made along the way. There is evidence in the past that large-scale chemical contamination has occurred elsewhere. What's unique about this is that it's the second wildfire caused large-scale chemical contamination. But we as a nation have figured out how to respond to these incidents. And one of the issues I think that is lacking is that transmission of knowledge across state governments, across health agencies, so that they can collectively start several steps up the educational ladder, instead of having to be the first time for everybody that goes through it.
So Dr. Jackson, why don't you take the last question?
Maybe I misunderstood. If the water had benzene in it and we're told not to boil it because it might raise the benzene levels in the air, that seems, maybe I misheard that, but it seems strange that you'd get much benzene in a 27 cubic meter room from 2 liters of water that a few parts per billion.
Right, so the assumption that it's a few parts per billion is a big assumption. So initially early on, they just had a few parts per billion. I think 8.1 parts per billion, and then 5 parts per billion. But as you see, 40,000 parts per billion was detected in Santa Rosa. We don't know what the highest level is going to be in Paradise Irrigation District or the Delaware Water Company systems. And so what I would say is trying to figure out what is that exposure. So if you boil water with 40,000 parts per billion of benzene, what is that exposure? And then is that exposure acceptable or not? So a lot of the decisions, my understanding early on, were based on best choices. And the boil water advisory was issued because that's what's typically done when you depressurize. And then the don't boil the water advisory was to just limit exposure associated with it. So you hit the nail right on the head. Some of the science needs to go towards actually predicting and understanding what these exposures are and whether or not the water use advisories that are being issued are appropriate or they need to be upgraded.
So thanks again, Dr. Whelton, for a great talk, and thanks for the participation of our audience. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Kaiser.